Thank you so much, Mata and Gajanti, for those introductions and for the invitation to be part of this lecture series. I've unfortunately, just because of the time zone, I've missed others, but I've been following kind of the lineup, and it looks really brilliant. So I'm just sharing my screen. So what I'm going to speak about, as has been mentioned, what I'm going to speak about is this project called the Archive of Forgetfulness, which is a collaborative Pan-African podcast series and online exhibition, which has been running for the last sort of year and a half, almost year and a half. And as part of the talk, I'm going to kind of introduce the project and also share some excerpts of projects that are part of it to kind of show examples of what's been included and then talk a bit about what it means to think about this archive in the framing of care. I think it's worth saying up front that although I'm an architect, and I realized as I was preparing the excerpts I've chosen, there are many architects involved. There are also many non-architects involved. So this particular project is not explicitly architectural, although for me personally, it's been a really interesting and provocative way of thinking about spatial and architectural archives. And I look forward to talking about that further if that's possible. So the Archive of Forgetfulness is a collaborative Pan-African podcast series and online exhibition funded by the Goethe Institute. It currently has 8 podcasts, 22 artist projects of various forms, 5 essays alongside 6 regionally curated works, and 1 is still in the making, but the other 5 have already been launched earlier this year. 1 actually just earlier this week. Amongst these artworks, conversations, and provocations are many powerful pieces centered on the African continent, which question forms of entanglement, sonic and textual archives, questions of Black flight, dreams of other worlds that could have been possible and might have been, and ways of living otherwise. I'm currently project manager and lead co-curator alongside Bongani Kona, yet part of a wider team of researchers and artists, including Zakia Hafaji, who's assistant curator and social media manager, and with regional curators, Princess Mshlongo from South Africa, Ali Al-Adawi from Egypt, Eric Ngangare from Rwanda, Omnia Shoka from Sudan, Zubeida Msefer from Morocco, and Jumoke Sanwo from Nigeria. And then working on graphics, which I'll show today, include Graham Aronser, Sarah de Villiers, and website design by Fred Kanamea. And with support from Asma Diakite, Head of Cultural Programs for Southern Africa at the Goethe Institute, Johannesburg. I think it's really important to mention these names up front because this is a collaborative project, and many of these people, in fact, all of the regional curators have actually been involved in the project longer than I have. So the project builds on a pre-existing Africa-wide Goethe Institute funded project titled Neighborhoods. And this is where the regional curators were initially involved. The project Neighborhoods was interested in questions of mobility across the African continent rather than focusing on flight and escape, and was first started in 2018. It is a particularly unique project for the Goethe Institute as it deliberately involved, actually, currently there are 6 institutes, previously there were a few more, across the historic regional divide of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, which is how the institutes are structured. So in 2020, the beginning of the current life of this project, I was invited to be involved as a project manager, and we made a move away from the static framing of the neighborhood to ask what it means to think about neighborliness and conversations with neighbors, to rethink borders, and to ask what it means literally, culturally, and politically to engage with the materialities, histories, and narrations of movement. This phase of the broader project began during COVID-19 lockdowns, when the ability to move was particularly limited. With our heightened sense of being and breathing, we were acutely aware of the longer and deeper histories of forced immobility and segregation, of extractive infrastructures and racial violences made material in how cities and places across the African continent were imagined and their histories written. So drawing inspiration from Mahmoud Darwish's prose-length poem, Memory for Forgetfulness, we questioned how we might engage with what exists in the failure of memory and that which can no longer be spoken, yet also acknowledge forgetting as an active part of remembering. As Anne Whitehead has written, a degree of forgetting is as important as remembering in the aftermath of catastrophes. Forgetting might be a privilege. But in other contexts, forgetting is not only the shadowy underside of memory, but shapes and defines the very contours of what is recalled and preserved, what is transmitted as remembrance from one generation to the next, and what is handed down to us in our turn to cherish or discard, but above all to reflect on. So in our search for those contours and shapes, however murky or distant, we began the project with invitations as a means to draw lines of connection across the African continent, where they might be maintained despite disruptions. And so this project began both as an open call, inviting submissions to this archive, and with a podcast series which ran from October 2020 to January 2021, through which we hoped to widen and open up key questions with invited voices, readings, and interviews. The podcast series, titled Conversations with Neighbors, was curated by myself and Bongani Kona, and each episode was structured around a set of questions, deliberately drawing together into conversation geographical frameworks that exceeded the national space, along with engaging various forms of archival modalities. We were mindful of forms and ways of archiving, which ranged from oral to sonic and filmic to written, built, and performed, and of how these varying forms might be spoken to in a podcast form and sit alongside one another, prompting further questions and conversations. The central questions for the podcasts were, and the posters are what you see here, included what personal, political, and cultural histories emerge via infrastructures of mobility, what remains of political and cultural ideas that imagined the African continent as the utopia of a borderless world, drawing on Achille Mbembe's work. And perhaps as an overarching question too broad to answer, how do the dreams of freedom, of other worlds that might have been possible and ways of living otherwise haunt our present? So I want to speak to a few kind of excerpts from podcasts and, oh gosh, sorry. Apologies. Okay. In episode 3, architect and academic Mena Agha gives voice to the Nubian bonds of kinship that survive the crossing of vast territories between Sudan and Egypt, a practice which rejected borders, ruptures, and distances. Agha narrates the story of her great-grandmother as a stand-in for an entire generation of Nubian women who saw the closing down of borders between Egypt and Sudan. She points to the paradox of the post-colonial moment in Egypt, where Gamal Abdel Nasser's ideas of Pan-Africanism were contrasted with the racialized treatment of Nubians and mass displacement of villages in the forming of Lake Nasser, or Lake Nubia as it is otherwise known. Yet she also points to the labor and work done by women like her great-grandmother to maintain connections across the border between post-colonial Sudan and Egypt, which she describes as a rejection and refusal of the status quo. These are worlds constituted through active relationships despite vast distances, and the arduous journeys that needed to be endured. This new landscape of displacement villages formed in the post-colonial moment of promise marks the shadowy underbelly of these utopian ideals. This narrative was mirrored by architectural historian Kukwa Manful's description of similar contradictions found in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana from its inception. As she notes in a similar conclusion to Agha, yet reflecting on the Togoland region, the post-colonial moment opened up possibilities of connection across borders and the idea of a borderless world. and yet also set in place national borders. In particular, Manful reflects on the place of minor histories in deepening our readings of Pan-Africanism. Following Anne Stoller, she notes that minor histories should not be mistaken for trivial ones, and they might give us clues on how to read the present. In episode 4, sociologist Sarah Salem shared a reading from her essay Fractured Flight, where she unravels the workings of coloniality and capital from the vantage point of the sky. She shares how highways and flight paths reveal points of connection and disconnection. Read through this is a reading of an essay of personal and political reflections of traveling between Cairo and Lusaka. And this is an essay that is actually part of the race space and architecture curriculum as an engagement published last year. In a very different vein, in episode 7, in an interview with Bongani Kona, the novelist Ivan Adiambo Owur opens up the question of the African oceanic imaginary and wider relationship with the ocean from the Swahili seas. She questions the names we have for the Swahili seas, and through her research points to the wider, longer, and deeper histories of engagements with the waters and imaginaries that extend beyond Africans only being cargo in the Middle Passages. And indeed, she questions the limitation of history to atrocity. In particular, she draws on Haji Gora Haji, a poet and seafarer who she interviews in Zanzibar in her search for Swahili poem maps. These poem maps are navigational maps of the waters recited by sailors to find their way. Haji Gora Haji describes reciting his way from Tumbatu Island in Zanzibar to Yemen by a play of words, a verbal enunciation of mapping. And so through this work, she's drawing lines of connection not only on the African continent, but also beyond. And I want to share a reading of Haji Gora Haji's, one of his poems.
Ukichungua bahari, ina mengi yalosiri, hata ukiwa hodari. Bahari ina mawimbi, kadhalika na vitimbi, kama sirangi na vumbi. Mengi yasoidadika, pindi ukisadifika, lazima hutetemeka. Ikiwa umo chomboni, kaa utulie ndani, ukitizama majini. Bahari usichungue, omba Mola akuvue. Be wary before the ocean, it remains cryptic, however intrepid you are. The sea contains waves, other mysteries and riddles, where it is not for the colour and dust, unaccountable things there are. When it approaches, you must tremble. When you are in the vessel, concentrate on your confines, for should you glimpse the jinns. Don't delve too deeply into the sea, beseech God's help.
In episode 6, South African architect and scholar Ilse Wolff ruminates on also working with poetry, ruminates on an early poem by Bessie Head called My Home, where Bessie Head invites us into her home. She writes, "Come and see my home. It's any place where nobody gives orders." End quote. This is clearly an invitation, but she asks that anyone who accepts the invitation should take a certain responsibility. And she asks, and I quote again, "Tread softly, the walls breathe peace, deep, dark, black peace, and the wind don't blow." End quote. With this deep, dark, black peace, Ilse Wolff takes us with the act of blowing from Bessie Head's home to the act of blowing as a soothing balm for children, to John Coltrane's 1966 performance in Nagasaki in search of health, care, and black peace on earth. These are a few shared excerpts, very short excerpts, of the many stories gathered and generously shared with us. Beyond the specificities of these stories and the details of histories, gestures, bodily acts of remembering and searching for names that have been forgotten, these conversations point to questions around archival labor and the many forms it might take and ways it might live. They suggest alternative epistemic formations and are decidedly undisciplined. They point to a productive engagement with what might be an assumed absence. The conversations act as points to interrogate the archival encounter, in turn suggesting a relational mapping through the body, voice, gesture, and sound, within but also beyond the African continent, through lines of connection that may have been forgotten, but have not been lost and are certainly not absent. So these incredibly rich conversations form the basis for the online exhibition, launched in April 2022, so earlier this year, 2021, sorry, earlier this year. Responses to the open call consisted of 22 selected artworks and 5 essays. And I want to speak again to a few examples, but also sort of share excerpts to speak a bit around the theme of this particular lecture series. And the 3 works that I'll speak to are a spoken word piece by Alea Kassam called For Wangari Maathai at Uhuru Park, a film project by Sharice Dilraj, Existence is an Occupation, and a film and archive, the Kujiona series by Arafa Cynthia Hamadi. So I'll start with an excerpt piece before speaking to it.
For Wangari Maathai at Uhuru Park, this soil here. Take a deep breath. This soil here holds our lungs. This soil here gives us breath. This soil here remembers a woman. This soil here remembers a woman who foolish men once called a mad woman. A woman who understood that destroying the very thing that gives you breath is... Because in 1989, this soil here was almost destroyed to create a business complex, or a parking lot, or an expressway to the airport. Now, that is... But this soil here remembers that woman who inspired other women to come together to protect this soil here, and that soil there, and the soil we don't even know about. This soil is proof of their victory. This soil is still imprinted with the feet of those women dancing a dance of victory. But this soil here holds shame. This soil remembers mothers. In 1992, women made this soil their home for 11 months in protest, in defiance, in refusal, in demand that their sons be released from illegal detainment. On this soil, they refused to eat. No freedom, no food. This soil here was drenched by their tears, stained by their blood, trampled by the boots of those meant to protect us. This soil here saw their naked bodies, mothers with no choice but to strip naked to save their children's lives. This soil here was witness to that curse. This soil here is witness to their power. This soil here remembers what happens when a government makes the mistake of ignoring women. This soil here remembers when promises are broken. This soil here couldn't care less if you're a Moheshimiwa. This soil here doesn't need to see your ID card. This soil here is for you because of a woman. This soil here remembers her name. Here is for you to be here in whatever way you need, whenever you need. This soil here is for you to lie down here and paint your dreams in the clouds here, to close your eyes here and remember that when you were a little girl and your late Nana Baba brought you to this soil here, the jacarandas had painted the soil there purple. This soil here is for you. To take a moment here, to teach them how to skip here, to rub this soil off their clothes when they fall down here. Shh. If you listen carefully, in this soil here, you can hear whispered prayers and hearts breaking. You can hear so many different types of laughter. You can hear the hopes of a people who call this soil here home. This soil here remembers.
Alea Kassam is a Kenyan feminist storyteller, writer, and performer. Her spoken word eulogy, titled for Wangari Maathai at Uhuru Park, pays homage to the history of Maathai's protest and refusal. In 1989, as she notes, the Kenyan government wanted to destroy Uhuru Park to build a 60-story business complex. Maathai led the protests that saved Uhuru Park so millions of people in Nairobi could enjoy a green space. 30 years later, as Kassam notes, they thought we had forgotten. In 2019, the Kenyan government wanted to build an expressway to the airport. For Kassam, Wangari Maathai's spirit was with them when they held protests to save the park. And this memory poem is a warning. Kassam's work draws out feminist practices of resistance and refusal. Her powerful intonation of the soil remembering through spoken word offers an active form of remembering and a living archive in itself of repeated violence. Yet it is also a protest in its own right and a gesture of gratitude to those who have come before, to refer to the essay by Khopoleng Moloi, which I'll return to later. I think also interestingly, she asks us to listen carefully to the soil, but also to those who've come before.
For Wangari Maathai.
So, second work that I want to share is by the South African artist Cherise Dilraj, and it's a film titled Existence is an Occupation. Dilraj is an artist interested in migration and inherited histories, and in this particular work, she draws out legacies of colonialism, settler colonialism, and neocolonialism as entangled in the present. The first part of this film references Miriam Makeba as A Piece of Ground, which chronicles the history of settler colonialism, land dispossession in what became South Africa, naming and dating the 1913 Land Act and the discovery of gold in 1883. In the inclusion of the song in her film, Dilraj, in a similar move to Kassam, invites us to listen again to Makeba, acknowledging the importance of this song and Miriam Makeba herself as a chronicler and archive. Again, we are asked to think about this relationship to land. Dilraj then turns to popular records of forced removals in 2020 in post-apartheid South Africa during lockdowns, forced removals by the South African police force, but also by the Israeli Defense Force, drawing out the long history of forced displacement into the present and as relational as part of the global order. And I will play only the first half of this film.
When the white men first came here from over the seas, he looked and he said, "This is God's own country." He was mighty well pleased with this land that he found, and he said, "I will make here my own piece of ground." Now many's the battle he still had to fight, and many's the family who died in the night, 'cause many's the black men who lived all around, all of them wanting their own piece of ground. Then one fine day in 1883, gold was discovered in good quantity. Now the country was rich and was richer than planned, and each digger wanted his own piece of land. white diggers were few and the gold was so deep. Black man was cold cause his labor was cheap. With cruel and a shovel, it's all underground. 6 pennies a day to tender the ground. Now this land is so rich and it seems strange to me that the black man whose labor has helped it to be cannot enjoy the fruits that abound. He's uprooted and kicked from his own piece of land. Why some people say, now don't you worry, we'll get you a nice piece of reserved territory. But I'll give my love that 10 million can be found on a miserable 30% of the ground. Yes, some people say, now don't you worry, you can always find jobs in the white man's city, but don't stay too long and don't stay too deep, for you're bound to disturb the white man in his sleep. White men don't sleep long and don't sleep too deep, for your life and possessions, how long will you keep? 'Cause I've had a rumor that's running around, for the black man's demanding his own piece of
South African Defence Force, A Winter's Tale. A mother swaddled her baby in a warm blanket, nursed it, fed it, kept it warm. A colony of red ants stormed in the dead of night, dropped her baby,
Don't touch it.
ripped her breast out of her chest.
Okay, I think there is a bit more to this film, but I think I'll stop it there. Not sure what happened. So as with Kassam, Dilraj is asking us to listen carefully to what we see, but also to engage with an archive through a popular form of music, such as Miriam Makeba. But again, as mentioned, to simultaneously recognize Miriam Makeba as a chronicler of resistance in the first place. Okay, so the third project that I want to share it's called the Kujiona series by Arafa Cynthia Hamadi. And Arafa Cynthia Hamadi is a non-binary, multidisciplinary artist working in Tanzania and Kenya. They create work in various mediums that address the intersection of the conceptual, physical, and ephemeral. In this particular work, the artist is carefully restoring and reworking a scavenged dhow. Being from Dar es Salaam and having lived in various towns along the Swahili coast, they describe a process of relearning about their home and the people who lived there. The Kujiona series is born from this process and a collection of conversations or histories during the last 3 months of 2020, offering an archive of the labor of repair and relearning and restoring, in some ways a meditation, and a series of conversations and gendered histories of the Swahili coast. And I will play an excerpt from this.
conversations about my project, and I've really, really enjoyed what you've had to say and different ways you've given me direction. Like whenever I would say something like before I thought, oh, like queer history does not exist in the Swahili context, but you've said, no, actually there are stories being created today, but also past stories where you can see instances of queerness that are not as obvious, and no one will write these were gay people, or if they write that, it's bad. It's like written as a bad thing. And like you've kind of just been giving me these little directives in a way to be more open of accepting that Swahili culture is not what is written, or really what is told, more like we are.
I think that's the beauty of it. I think not just we forget the power of oral history and the power of oral literature and how these things get passed on, where people say they'll skia or I've had. And I think when it comes to just no expert, and I haven't done much reading since we last spoke. I think for me we forget the power of oral literature, and also we have to factor in the environment within which we live in. I think and I don't know if you ever get to read Dragonfly Sea, Yvonne War.
I've seen the book. I haven't read it.
Please read it. If you're investigating that Swahili culture, and I want to go to Lamu. I don't have the money, but I want to go to Lamu. It's one of the most beautiful books I have read.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think this particular film is quite long. Okay. So this particular film is part of a series that they have been working on, and this is and both archiving this process of restoring and repairing this style, but also collecting a series of conversations around gender and queer histories on the Swahili coast. And so these three projects form part of many others. As I mentioned, there's 22 plus the 5 essays. And over the course of 2021, there have been 5 additional regionally curated projects to date, with the final project to be launched at the end of November by Spitzer. The regional curators have all been involved in this project much longer, and their individual projects add to and extend further questions of how we might think of archives. From Eric Ngangare's ruminations on cross-border living between Kigali and Bujumbura, to Princess Mshlongo's collection of and engagement with the meaning of clan praises, Izibongo and Izitakazelo, of names lost and found in the course of migration, where she asks, where do we go to remember who we once were? In this poignant question, Mshlongo asks us to think through and work through a spatial relationship of memory. Jumoke Sanwo's opus, Dunadura, engages the Obalende night market in Lagos as operating between the living and dead, creating a space of encounter and renegotiation. Amnia Shokat speaks to the politics of art in contemporary Sudan, although a few months ago, as much has changed in the last few weeks. And Ali Al-Adawi's project, launched earlier this week online, asks how we might engage with archives speculatively, situating Egypt as part of an African neighborhood. Each of these projects has and continues to operate independently and as part of the Archive of Forgetfulness, with their own conversations, localities, and specificities. While undisciplined and wide-ranging, they offer a series of provocations, open up questions, and engage with history, archives, and certainly for me, questions of spatial archives. Okay, so to kind of draw to a conclusion, but also to draw out some things from these works. Essay by curator and writer Khopoleng Moloi, included in this project, she suggests that gestures of gratitude might offer a modality and form of engagement with the archive. Central to her work and essay in this collection are the acts of reflecting, imagining, dreaming, and communing, as she follows the history of an enslaved woman known as Groote Katerijn in the Cape Archives. For Moloi, drawing on Saidia Hartman, gratitude encourages us to recognize the importance of others in making our lives livable when history is a catastrophe. Many of the works in this wider Archive of Forgetfulness project engage with the forgotten, marginal, or minor through acts of remembering the labor, resistance, and refusal, where the archive becomes a site of possibility, of engaging with history anew. The work of memory here is a labor of care that works against silencing and neglect, as memory for forgetfulness. In episode 1 of Conversations with Neighbors, the first podcast of the series, in a conversation between myself, Ali Al-Adawi, and Jumoke Sanwo, two of the regional curators, we discussed what it means to think about anti-colonial and cross-border archives through questions of the untranslatable and opaque. The conversation points to archiving as a space of possibility and a portal for imagination, in the words of Sanwo, as a space from where we might confront history. Jumoke Sanwo suggests that the Yoruba word for archive is itoju and can be translated as care. And indeed, the question of how we might build anti-colonial archives as resources that are expansive and open-ended, offering reflexive positions and emancipatory methodologies, is central to this wider project. For both Sanwo and Ali Al-Adawi, recognizing or working with care and archives as spaces of intervention and spaces of possibility is also about pushing back against the coloniality of dispossession of both history and land. So while this collection of works, voices, stories, and interventions is admittedly undisciplined and open-ended, I think for myself and for in different ways for others involved, they point to a series of openings and ways of engaging the archive in a different manner. While momentary engagements might draw out different connections, central to these works more generally is the importance of the positional and relational. An open field, perhaps more the starting point for new conversations and collaborations than any definitive offering in itself. Yet, to return to Stuart Hall, archives are not inert historical collections. They always stand in an active dialogic relation to the questions which the present puts to the past. And the present always puts its questions differently from one generation to another. So for us, these varied works drawn from a range of histories, contexts, and sites offers a contestation against lines of force, positioned in relation to both futurity and contingency, an engagement and an interruption, albeit as these works show, into a far from settled field. Stuart Hall argues that building an archive represents a moment of careful reflection. I think what these works show is that building an archive also represents a moment of care. It requires a self-conscious positioning to construct categories and conceptual frames. In many of these works, the stretching of time from the violent present to the captured past enables us to draw out the sustained practices of inequality and ongoing power dynamics within of history. It also questions whether returning to sites and stories, often overlooked by disciplinary boundaries, can enable us to escape the repetition of this violence, and suggests alternative ways of reading and writing across borders, south and north, on the continent, but also beyond, across borders of the center and periphery, where caring to listen and caring to hear becomes a means of acknowledging historical practices of resistance and refusal. Okay. I'm going to actually stop there, and I look forward to questions or discussing further.
May I? So I thank you, Huda, and was very taken by some of your argument at the end of the lecture. So about archives as sites of possibility. I found that that's very provocative, and I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that, especially the very provocative idea of an anti-colonial archive. Because it's almost by definition that archive is like or at least the archives that I know are almost all of them colonial projects. And I also think we'd like to hear more. So we think, when I think of archive, when we generally think of archive, we think of written documents. I mean, usually document by power. And in fact, much of this, of the project, much of the works in the Archive of Forgetfulness have to do with oral traditions, so not with the written one. Perhaps, again, I would like you to comment on that, both on the, again, the very possibility of an anti-colonial archive and how you actually, so how do you archive an oral tradition? Or how do you think of that not as some kind of inert collection of recordings of voices, but as well, as something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. You have two really good questions. I think, yeah, I think you're right around what it means to think of a formal archive that has a very particular history and a particular context. And I think definitely what we're doing in this project is we're using the term not necessarily in that way, which I think is very clear. So we're using it more as a kind of repository, and in a way kind of opening up from that starting point. So thinking, and I think, and that is, I think I've been thinking about this quite a bit in relation to, well, the discipline of architecture specifically, because I do think that based in even like working in South Africa or teaching in South Africa, South African students, I think in many ways being on the margins of the discipline already just automatically by how it's positioned, many of these kinds of terms don't hold the kind of, they're automatically unmade in the way people think about them. So, and I see this, and I think I've only realized it recently because I see this specifically in working with students. So there is something in how we're using archive where we are deliberately I think we understand this reference to the colonial archive and the repository, and also particular post-colonial governments. So people like Nkrumah who very actively created archives of their state, but we're also using the term in a very loose way to think about histories rather than histories and wider forms. I think the possibility of an anti-colonial archive and what it means to think about oral collections, I think is it's a question that I don't think I can specifically answer, but I think that it is something that we have been speaking about, but also, and the archive as kind of speculative or intervention is something that certainly is what this project, the conversations are about. And in many ways, it's definitely still something kind of in conversation, and perhaps by the nature of it can't ever be fixed or whole. But I think it's about ways of reading and ways of recognizing histories that exist beyond the archive, beyond these formal archives, but sometimes may be within them. So one of the something that I, earlier this evening, because it's in reworking my presentation, I actually took out is a project that I've been working on where I'm looking at Cape Dutch architectures in Cape Town, and specifically looking at architectural archives. And I had it included initially. And it's been a kind of side project for me alongside sort of other work that I've been doing, which focuses a lot more on more recent migrant histories. But it was work that I've been kind of returning to this, to these not late 19th and early 20th century writings of Cape Dutch architecture. And Cape Dutch architecture is from usually around 17th to 18th century, but remade in the early 20th century. And these were slave-holding plantations in the Cape. And a lot of the histories that are written about this, and it's very kind of widely taught in schools, often cited as the beginning of architectural history. A lot of the histories talk about the absence of slave narratives or slave histories. And I think as someone initially studying it or having to teach these kinds of things, I was initially kind of accepted something like this at face value. But more recently, when I've been re-looking at these archives, I'm increasingly interested in, and these are archives kind of proper, I'm increasingly interested in how there are stories, and actually for me, kind of an incredible number of stories around things like slave mutinies, references to, in fact, there's one particular excerpt that I've written about in a recent, well, earlier this year, around, you know, people hearing. So within these, there are architectural histories, there are measured drawings, there's categorizations of gables and styles. There's these mentions of these kind of interruptions and disruptions. And I think for me, this kind of caring to hear and caring to listen as an archival modality is also about what it means to read these archives as they are for those minor histories that are within them. And so, yeah, but at the same time, I don't think that, I think we have to understand that these are, well, we know they're exclusive spaces, they're only for certain kinds of stories and certain kinds of forms. And so if we don't look beyond them, I think, and beyond what they hold, I think we miss out on a lot of the histories of place and space and land. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question fully. I think it's yeah.
Oh, you did. I'm wondering if if in addition to speaking of minor histories, one in fact could bring in the idea of microhistory. In fact, so some of the work of historians like Carlo Ginzburg have been precise in that, and reading, for example, through, let's say, actual archives, as say archives of the Inquisition, but in order to find, in fact, not just the voice of power, but also, so there are ways to excavate the archives of power to, in fact, unfold other kinds of stories. So there have been historians that have looked at in the documents of power with the different land, not to see necessarily what the state does or records of what, but to read against the grain of the documents themselves. There's a whole body of micro histories, micro in the sense not so much of tiny and insignificant, micro more in the sense of looking with a microscope at or with a different lens at the same type of documents.
Thank you, Cesare. There is a question in the chat from Jerome Hayford. Perhaps Jerome, you would like to ask the question if you are here.
Hi, yes, I'm on the street, so it's a little bit loud.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I just sent Vijanti because I couldn't send to everybody that indeed, you know, we can find archival proper evidence of these sort of minor histories, but they often enter the archive, as you were describing, through instances of violence and or punishment. So I'm curious if you thought about ways, or if you enact ways or methods of archival resistance to image those subjectivities more fully, and how is that possible, and how?
So I think, I mean, in this work that I've just been mentioning, thinking about Cape Dutch architecture and what it means to think about, I guess, effectively slave women subjectivities, I'm very much, I think that we cannot fully know the voice of the slave woman, and we have to acknowledge that, because I think following Spivak, you know, she was not in a subject position from which to speak in the first place. And so what I've been, I mean, part of my kind of rereading of the archives in that instance actually came through reading fictional works by, particularly influenced by Yvette Christianse, and she has a novel called Unconfessed, where which is based on her archival research in the Cape Archives and really engaging with the silences. And I think for me, through reading her work, what her work did for me were two things. It was really to make me think very carefully about what these spaces mean and these violent histories, but not only through the objectification of the slave, but also through what it means to think about the stories as, I think in some ways, as a kind of, I mean, to use the words I spoke of earlier, a kind of, Hopeleng Moloi talks about these gestures of gratitude, but I think it's also around something about a kind of recognition and mourning for particular kinds of lives that are not in the archives. But through reading these fictional, and there are a few other figures like Khabiba Badroun's work, through reading some of these fictions and going back to the archives, I think also allowed me to see these archives very differently. And so I think for me, like thinking with Spivak, the problems of, and more broadly, the problems of these kind of disciplinary boundaries or strictures are really like significant in what it means to think about, you know, many of these histories proper and archives proper are really fictions of a place. They're fictions in that, and I can say, you know, specifically on the particular houses, they're about buildings that have been remade in a particular image with certain parts or erased, and some of it is acknowledged and some of it is not fully acknowledged. And so I think for me, partly like reading fiction as history and history as fiction has been a really kind of productive way of thinking about these histories. And maybe also goes back to this question of, you know, we think, I think in a certain academic sense, we think of oral histories as less formal or less weighty, but in many ways, you know, what makes them so? Because especially if you're thinking about the willfulness of forgetting, we could say similar things about archives. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if I've answered your question. It's a bit late. But
No,
I think,
it's
yeah,
wonderful. Yes, I agree, and I'm excited to look up some of those other texts you mentioned. Thank you.
No, thanks. Yeah, I think it's around that. I think it's exactly that. You know, what I'd be doing, but I'm, you know, exploring some of this. So I think that's where I lost.
Yeah, my question is what happens to the method when the geographic frame shifts? That's the question. It isn't a matter of suggesting that one can just extrapolate a method and plop it down someplace else. In fact, that's exactly contrary to your argument, and which I appreciate enormously. But so I wondered, what if we were to try to do similar work in this country, and how, what benefit it would bring, right, to us in the North Americas, in North America.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure, because I do think that it is very much contextualized. I think the kinds of questions that we're asking have relate or drawn from particular ways of thinking about Pan-Africanism and a particular moment of liberation and what it means to think about those moments as spaces of possibility. And that's kind of at the heart of the project. Even if, you know, some of the projects kind of look to different kinds of, to earlier histories or more recent histories. So there is something quite specific. I do think that, I mean, I think for me, what the project, I think everyone involved in this project has, it's different depending on where they're coming from and what they find in it. For me, what's been really important and interesting has been to think about, because I do work in an architecture school and I teach architectural history. And I think the African continent in particular is always the kind of absent present in architectural history curricula. So it's, you know, not even on the Bannister Fletcher tree, whereas other continents are there. And it's sort of, and so a lot of the work around African architectural history either focuses on on kind of expat modernism or a very kind of, or very particular ideas to think and ways of thinking about vernacular architectures. And so I think there've been many critiques of this and I do think, I'm not saying that this work is necessarily not valuable or even those works that I'm speaking about. But I do think that there is a kind of particular problematic around the absolute absence that is also, again, like very much contextual. And so for me, like working on this project, my involvement actually came out of because my PhD research and most of my research is really around migration. And my involvement came out of a series of conversations where I was invited because that was the kind of main focus. But through the project, I think through various, both artist works, but also the various people involved in conversations, I think what I've been more acutely aware of than before is both the kinds of conversations that are happening on different parts of the continent at very local levels that I think are often not acknowledged in kind of global academia or in certain circles, but also ways of thinking or not ways of thinking about archives, but actually certain archives that I think are incredibly I think what I find in them and the particular examples that I've shown here, for instance, are that I think they show ways of thinking about space and spatial histories that would never be included in a canonical understanding of architecture or architectural history, but I think are really important if we want to think about architectural history on the continent. So I think, and I don't think this is about a kind of recuperation, I think it really means rethinking the kind of epistemic frameworks for what we think about architecture in the first place. I think there's a lot of work still to be done to make that gap, but that's been my kind of really quite profound experience through conversations and things where I'm like, wow, this is incredibly powerful and valuable and for various reasons. And I think there's something in that. And maybe in that is also something about what it might mean to think about other places that, the problem of the discipline, I guess, is not unique to the continent, even if certain conversations here are.
Thank you.
There's one more question in the chat, if you can see it, Huda, from Mohamedou Diang.
Yeah, I can just exit right now. So my question was about a slide about existence as an occupation. So my question was, if existence is a occupation, then how does existence change in relation to various pushing, pulling, migrations, erasures of culture? What do we occupy when our original occupation has been destroyed or forgotten in the sense?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a kind of, I was thinking about this phrase when I was preparing and like rewatching that video, because it is kind of, I think for many reasons, like what it means to think about occupation and existence is kind of raises questions. I'll maybe answer your question by talking to the project by Princess Mshlongo, which I think is a really like beautiful and powerful project. And I'll just pull up the slide quickly because I didn't. So I think one of the things that I don't have permission to share anymore. Oh, it's fine. One of the things that I found really, I think that all of us, so the selection committee was really the entire group of regional curators. One of the things we found really powerful about the works that were submitted or a lot of the engagements was that they were not about recuperating some lost past. They were very much about engaging with history, but understanding certain traditions as important, but also not as unchanging. So I think working against that kind of in a way that a lot of vernacular architecture is understood as kind of fixed in time and place and history and unchanging. And so this project by Princess Mhlongo, I think, is one example, and I think you can see it in different works. And Mhlongo is a performance artist and theatre maker who's South African. And this project is really interesting. So she had proposed something quite different initially. She's been involved in the project preceding me, 2018. And through these discussions around Archives of Forgetfulness, she proposed this as a response as something that is a collection of Izibongo and Izitakazelo. And these are clan praises. And clan praises are fairly common in Southern Africa as ways of really positioning oneself in relation to a longer lineage. But her arrival at this project came both through, based on conversations with her, both through conversations around the Archive of Forgetfulness and this particular framing and how the project has shifted in the last year, but also in actually in finding out that her father was adopted. And so with something like adoption, a lineage gets broken. And what she did in this project, which I think is really powerful, is she collects clan phrases she starts with immediate family, and she collects these lineages. And then she uses this as a basis of a wider conversation, but also collecting lineages that extend, that really trace certain migrations, and acknowledges both movement. In this case, there's 25 collections in this particular project, and I think it's part of a bigger project that she's now working on, that acknowledges the importance of this particular form and tradition as still very important, as still actively used, as still kind of recognized, but also that moves beyond a kind of narrow sense of nationalism or even like fixed identities. And I think, so I think that's in the way that she's done it here. It's really, it's been through collecting certain histories, acknowledging disruptions, but also acknowledging the particular form and power of that form, but also collecting clan praises from people who might not typically have that, particularly from migrants who are not from these regions. And yeah, I think that would be my answer at this point. But I think it depends really on, I think each project does this quite differently. I think with the one I showed by Rafa, Cynthia Hamidia, I think there's also something really powerful around this, questions of gender and queerness in Swahili Coast and what it means to think about these archives, or not archives in a formal sense, but histories of queerness. And I think, I think there's various kinds of projects that engage with this in different ways.